Good morning. Welcome back. I like that energy. It's been a great day and a half, and we really appreciate all of your contributions. I'm going to go ahead and start with a little bit of, second acknowledgement of some of Elon's history so that we can preserve time for our conversation today. So yesterday, I acknowledged one portion of Elon University's roots, sharing the Okanichi's request that we treat this land with respect, love, and care. Today, I want to share one more portion of Elon's rich and complicated roots. In August of 2018, Elon President Connie LaDubuc announced the launch of the Commemoration Committee, later known as the Committee on Elon History and Memory, to explore questions related to historical memory and collective identity at Elon. At the link on the screen, you can access their Fall 2020 report, which includes 10 episodes about Elon's history that open multiple pathways for learning and opportunities for restorative justice. Each year at this conference, I share an excerpt from one of those 10 episodes, but this year I wanted to take a slightly different approach. One of the resources available on the committee's website is a virtual campus tour. And it explores historical injustices that occurred here and also celebrates the Black students, staff, and faculty who served as trailblazers here. If you have time after the conference this afternoon, you can also actually visit many of these locations in person. So I encourage you, if you want to take a moment to snap the QR code, it will take you to the virtual tour. But then from that, it actually has a map that you can use to navigate campus and visit these places in person. And one of the places is actually right here in Moseley. Near the lobby, there are portraits that were commissioned to honor Glenda Phillips Hightower, who was Elon's first full-time Black student, and Eugene Perry, the first Black student to graduate in 1969. And those now hang in the Moseley Center entrance, so you can see them while you're here. The scholarship on engaged learning too often underrepresents the experiences of minoritized engaged learners, whether they are Indigenous, Black, Latinx, queer, or embodying the intersection of these and other minoritized identities. So as we continue our own engaged learning research, I challenge us to ask who is represented in our work and who isn't? How might we make our research more inclusive so that research can better inform more equitable engaged learning practices? So that's my challenge for you. I know it's not a small challenge, but I hope that the closing keynote also gives us some food for thought on how we can work towards that goal in a collective way across our campuses and higher education. So to offer just a little bit of signposting for this final session, after our keynote discussion, I'll share a few additional details about how you can continue to interact with the Center for Engaged Learning. And for now, though, and also then after our keynote discussion, we've got box lunches already tempting us from the back of the room. So those will be available after our keynote as well. But for now, as we turn our focus to our final keynote of the conference, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists who will be joining me for the conversation, and I'll invite them to come on up. So we will be talking today about leadership and transformative inclusion in higher education. Rozana Carducci is an associate professor and graduate director of Elon University's Master's in Higher Education program. Her research and teaching interests include higher education leadership, the application of design thinking in higher education, qualitative methodologies, and the politics of inquiry. She is the co-author of Higher Education Leadership, Challenging Tradition and Forging Possibilities, and co-editor of Contested Issues in Troubled Times, Student Affairs Dialogues on Equity, Civility, and Safety, and also the co-edited collection Disrupting Qualitative Inquiry, Possibilities and Tensions in Educational Research. Jonathan McElderry and Stephanie Hernandez Rivera are co-editors of Developing an Intersectional Consciousness and Praxis, Moving Toward Anti-Racist Efforts in Higher Education. Jonathan is Dean of Student Inclusive Excellence at Elon University, and he serves as the 86th president of ACPA College Student Educators International. Stephanie is an assistant professor in the Master's of Higher Education program here at Elon and the Dr. Joe Watts Williams School of Education Emerging Scholar. Guided by women of color feminisms and race gender-based methodologies, her research focuses on the identity development, experiences, and resistance strategies of intersectionality, marginalized people in higher education, specifically women of color. So let me transition. I love when conversations start with good energy. So thank you all for joining me today. For our audience, I have a few questions to start our conversation, and then we will invite some questions from the audience as well. So to start us off, Stephanie and Jonathan, in your introduction to developing intersectional consciousness and praxis, moving towards anti-racist efforts in higher education, you note that you, quote, specifically name moving towards anti-racist efforts because you understand that anti-racism is aspirational at best, end quote. You trace groups that are resisting, quote, othering, silencing, and exclusion in equity-based work, end quote, and you call on institutional leaders to, quote, engage their communities in working towards equity and anti-racism, end quote. And I should pause. These are both really great books to read, so if you haven't yet, add them to your summer reading list. Those are
shameless plug.
Those are quotes that are pulled from a couple different pages, but it's inspirational reading and really challenges us to think about our roles. So first, just for a shared foundation for our discussion, could you briefly explain the concept of intersectional praxis as it shapes your scholarship?
Sure. So I want to start, also thank you everyone for being here. I want to start with maybe a foundation on what intersectionality is. I think most people in this room heard that terminology, yes. But I think that there's still confusion around what intersectionality actually is. Many people, I think, take it to mean multiple identities. So kind of how do your identities come together to formulate your experience? But intersectionality is much more complicated than that. We can consider it a theory, a framework, an analytic tool, an interpretive tool, and even a sensibility, so a way that you arrive to your work. When we're thinking about intersectionality, we're thinking about understanding that when we're looking at oppression and how oppression functions, we're analyzing it in the middle of multiple axes of analysis as opposed to one axis of analysis. So it's not necessarily additive, adding identities on top of each other, but saying this is the way that racism and sexism or heterosexism interlock, and that creates a very unique experience that is often invisible in larger conversations around equity and inclusion. So we're not just thinking about intersectionality, as Patricia Hook Hans would say, as like a theory of identity. It's really more a theory of power and how we examine and understand how power operates. So from that vantage point, if that's how we're understanding and arriving to understanding intersectionality, then we should recognize that intersectional praxis is about working to mediate the experience of oppression for those who are existing in the intersection of that buffer. I think for me personally, my scholarship largely explores the experiences of women of color, and one of the reasons it does that is because when I was working, I previously worked on a college campus in identity center work. I worked in a cultural center, and before that I worked in a women's center. And I would often find that students did not find a space that supported their experiences at the intersections of multiple identities. So they would have to go, if they even did, if they were students of color or women of color specifically, maybe they would not feel comfortable in the women's center because it was a predominantly white space. Or the same would go for the LGBTQ resource center. Or maybe they would not feel comfortable in a cultural center because we were not examining issues of gender or sexuality. And so it placed them outside of the margins of spaces that were intended to serve them. And so a more tangible example was when I conducted one of my studies on the experiences of women of color, there were 3 women of color who had experienced some form of interpersonal violence or observed interpersonal violence. Yet none of them had tapped into, on our campus, we had a relationship and sexual violence prevention center, which is pretty unique. A lot of campuses don't have a whole center staffed with 4 people to address interpersonal violence. Yet none of them had accessed that resource. And partly because they felt as though the programs that they created largely centered whiteness and how white women specifically experience interpersonal violence and harm. And so an intersectional praxis would mean that even if all the staff in that space happen to be white, but even if all the staff in that space happen to be white, they are still taking up a praxis that honors and complicates the way that we understand interpersonal violence, so that women of color specifically, would not feel like they have to kind of suffer in silence or not connect with people that would understand their experience. So I think for me, intersectional praxis is first and foremost a sensibility that considers who is not considered in this conversation, even around equity, and then placing that into action.
Thank you very much for that explanation. It's a great foundation for our conversation. And as a follow-up question, what might moving toward anti-racism in higher education, guided by an intersectional praxis, look like? And I think you've given one example of that, but there might be others that you want to elaborate on.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that it's understanding that there's not a single issue that can fix whatever system you're trying to fix in general, and understanding that what may work on one college campus or for one group of students doesn't work necessarily on another college campus or group of students. So it makes me think back, like in previous work that I've done, working at a Black Culture Center, not every Black student felt comfortable in that space or wanted to be in that space based on whatever intersecting identities. And so it was important for us in that time period at the University of Missouri to really think about the cross collaborations that we did with other areas, so the Multicultural Center, the Women's Center, to bring in different spaces, different bodies, different voices into the programming that we do. I think when thinking about just kind of intersectional practice, it's always continuously looking at your policies, your programs, and your practices, and understanding that they have to continuously evolve. And so what may have worked 10 years ago may not necessarily work now in this climate with this generation of students. And so I think a lot of times we kind of get stuck in like, we created this program, we created this office, boom, problem solved, and that's not actually what it is. I think we probably are having a discussion more now than ever since 2020 with George Floyd. And so, often my critique of a lot of institutions or areas who all of a sudden created chief diversity officers or created divisions was, what were you doing before that? And did you do it with an intentional plan in mind? Because from my background, where I went to school previously, we've had a diversity, equity, and inclusion division since the early 2000s. So all of a sudden, everybody rushing to create that was odd to me. And now we're kind of seeing the pendulum shift in the opposite way, where they're easily being dismantled. And they're easily being dismantled because there was no actual plan in place to actually sustain them and for them to be successful.
And maybe not part of the core values of the institution, unfortunately, as well, or at least the operationalized values. Yeah.
If I could add something too, I think, everybody in the room is an educator in some way, shape, or form. And so I think something that's really important is humble curiosity. I think a lot of us, by being educators, we are curious. We want to learn. We want to know about people's experience. But there is a way to do that recognizes that even if you have that knowledge, to Jonathan's point, it is not going to be able to apply to every single person. So just because you learn about, for example, how racism impacts a group of people of color doesn't mean that's going to translate to every single community. And so recognizing that having that curiosity is important, educating yourself on varying experiences is important, but arriving to that knowing that you're not kind of an all-knowing being. And I think taking that into action, it's also thinking about how does that show up in a classroom space. If you're have a syllabus, for example, that has the works and contributions of people of color, but all of them are cisgender or all of them are men, or you have the contributions of women, but all of them, or, queer people, but all of them are white. What's being communicated at the intersection? Or even thinking also about the names we know. Like, everybody probably knows the work of Bell Hooks. Yes, like, we know her. But are you using her as a token in your syllabus or in your content as like a check mark? Like, ooh, I got this person. Going beyond that to the point of like intersectionality earlier, intersectionality, a lot of us might know the name Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins, and they are notable figures in relation to intersectional work. But do you know the genealogy of intersectionality? Do you also know the work of the Combahee River Collective, of Sojourner Truth, of Ida B. Wells, that predate Crenshaw's work? So I think it's about understanding that you're always going to be the position of learner, and even when you take that into action, you're going to probably create error or flaw, but being able to be transparent about that is very important.
I love that, and it really fits in with how our center understands engaged learning as an ongoing, lifelong activity where we are actively and intentionally engaging in our own learning. And as faculty and staff, that's part of our role as well. So thank you for that reminder. Rozana, in higher education leadership, challenging tradition and forging possibilities, you and your co-authors write that, quote, leadership in both research and practice serves simultaneously as a barrier and a potential pathway to the systemic change needed to transform the academy and realize espoused equity commitments, end quote. What might we consider about traditional leadership perspectives if we want to minimize the potential of leadership as a barrier?
Thanks. So I want to put a little history to this book that we published in 2025, but actually this journey started in 2006. So in 2006, Adriana Kizar and Melissa Contreras-McGavin and I did a sort of a leadership literature review to kind of look at the contemporary landscape of theory and practice in leadership. And what we found in 2006 that like traditional leadership theories were alive and well. Hierarchy, individual-centered, trying to predict outcomes and what were the specific behaviors that effective leaders had. So we sort of said that body of literature is alive and well and still kicking in higher ed. And then we were seeing the expansion of what we then termed revolutionary, but we in 2025 renamed inclusive, which was theories and practices of leadership that espoused shared leadership, that were process and context-based, not universal. And so that's what we sort of found in 2006, and we had some optimism that higher education was on this journey towards sort of inclusive, shared leadership, and we were good to go. And so then 15 years later, Adriana Kizar and Jordan Harper and I, we sort of revisited the landscape, and we were pretty disappointed to see what we found, which was traditional leadership theories, still alive and well. Shared leadership theories, what we have again we renamed sort of inclusive leadership theories, were present in higher education. People were talking about transformational leadership. Leadership is contextual, it's process-based, but it wasn't leading, we weren't seeing the transformative change, right? If we were engaging in the shared leadership, we weren't seeing the transformative, equity-oriented change that people were calling for, the achievement of the public good mission. And so what we kind of theorized and we expanded in the book is that it's because traditional and many inclusive leadership theories are sort of rooted in and inadvertently or inadvertently perpetuating sort of the twin ideologies of neoliberalism and white supremacy. And they're sort of skirting over these underlying assumptions and not naming them. And so I think the contribution of our book was to sort of say, these traditional and inclusive leadership theories are a barrier to change. But leadership is a pathway, and what does that look like? And so we then tried to foreground critical leadership approaches that were really naming both the shared processes, shared power, inclusion, but also explicitly naming the role of neoliberalism and white supremacy and sort of sustaining these problematic assumptions, beliefs, and practices in higher education. And so then tried to foreground, again, these critical leadership works like Santa Maria and Santa Maria's Applied Critical Leadership, which takes an explicit critical race theory lens to leadership and looks at how we can use those principles to advance change.
Thank you. And a question for all of you now. Which conference topics or themes do you think might benefit from or inform equity-centered collective leadership guided by an intersectional praxis? we're asking easy questions today.
Yeah, I'll go first. I've been very transparent with Jesse. When I got the invitation to do this, I was like, my book's on leadership. Mentoring we talk about once, which now I reflect as a flaw in the book. I was like, oh, it was only mentioned in the construct of wisdom. That's an oversight. So I was like, why are you asking me to be here? But then yesterday, it really became clear as I was going to sessions, and even the keynote panel yesterday, they introduced the shared equity model of leadership, right? And thinking about leadership to change systems and structures, and both the personal journey that we have to do, so whether it's mentoring or other high impact practices, it begins with the personal, but it then transforms to systems and structures. And so I think that's for me was a big takeaway of yesterday is there is a personal journey, but through leadership processes, we need to be thinking about altering our systems, our power structures.
I would say thinking about the role of identity in mentoring. When I think about my own journey, I don't think I had a black male teacher or professor until I was my junior year of college. And so I didn't see any black male teachers K through 12. Like I saw black women, but not any black men. And so the importance of just representation and serving as that possibility model for the next generation, and so that they can see themselves in those roles. Like when we think about a lot of the first that have come forward in the last, several decades, thinking about President Obama and being the first black president, that could signal to a child at that point that this is a possibility for me, whereas before that may not have been or was not before a possibility. I think also just understanding as we think about intergenerationally that as we mentor this next generation, as we mentor peer mentoring, that what may have worked for one person may not work for the next. And so the importance of mentoring and understanding that you're there to help guide and kind of shape their next steps, but ultimately it's up to them to execute it. And so being comfortable with understanding that they may do it a different way, or it may be a way that's unconventional or different than how you came up, but that doesn't discredit how they got there as well.
Yeah, kind of building on further on what Jonathan is sharing, I think that idea of identity conscious mentoring, a session this morning that I attended talked about that, is so important. I echo Jonathan's sentiments around not having access to educators that share your identity or that look like you throughout your schooling experiences. It was very similar, for me. And kind of feeling like not only is it that representation, but the access to knowledge and content that comes with that representation, because there's a different level of awareness around, the material that you're assigning, I think is really important. I think being here at Elon, I'm in a predominantly white institution, and I work specifically with master's students. So I teach one undergraduate course a year. And in that course, it's almost always all white students. And one year that I taught it, it was all white students and 2 students of color, and one of those students was Latina. And I think she experienced some challenges that semester that another professor might have passed, I don't know, but could have passed off as through deficit ideology, through thinking about her in a deficit, especially because she was also first generation. And the fact that I didn't do that and arrived with more curiosity about who she was and her experience and an ethic of care, an ethic of what's going on? How can I support you versus just making assumptions about why she wasn't completing things or doing things, especially when she was coming to class. And so I think this is really important, because if we're making those assumptions about our students without even getting to know them, those assumptions are oftentimes, in this case, could be racially gendered and making a lot of assumptions about who she is and what she's bringing to the learning environment. And that created a different path for her and, forged a mentoring relationship that I don't think she even anticipated. And so I think that's really important in thinking about not just, building on the representation piece. I think also for colleagues who have to take on the added labor of being the only one, the students are often seeking them out. So how are you, if you're not of those identities, how are you alleviating that labor? Like, what kind of messages do you send to students that you are someone that they can confide in, and how do you work to build trust with them so they can be vulnerable, so you alleviate some of that additional emotional labor, or what some scholars refer to as identity taxation that people experience just because of their identity?
Thank you for those responses. I'm going to ask a follow-up, and then I'm also just going to warn the audience that in just a moment I'm going to invite your questions, so be prepared if you have any you'd like to ask. But I'm thinking about that note of how are we creating a space of trust. The students in yesterday's keynote were really emphasizing that as well, and that when we break trust, then we've got a challenge of a different variety, but the importance of building trust regardless of our identity, so that we are attending to those inequities, even how many of us there are here to represent different identities. So I'm curious, what are some of the, and this is off script, so I apologize, but what are some of the strategies that you use to help build trust for the student, in the student relationships that you are cultivating on campus?
I think the session that I was in this morning about identity conscious mentorship, as an example, somebody mentioned this, that sometimes that you don't know something as an instructor, that you admit that to the students. I actually don't know, like I have to think about that deeply. I think the challenge with that is that it makes you vulnerable, not just because you're seen as the authority, but I think especially when you have marginalized identities, students question your legitimacy more in terms of you being a knowledge holder. And so I think it's risky. I think it's worth the risk. And that would be my second thing, is that you kind of have to take risks as an instructor. And when it doesn't work out, you have to be willing to apologize to the student and admit when you're wrong. And I've had to do that. And it's not the easiest thing, but it builds and nurtures a relationship that I'm trying to forge. And I think building community at the start of a semester, not when you realize, oh, this is going downhill. Like, now's maybe not the time. Like, you've already breached the trust or, the possibility for community. Why didn't you think about that at the beginning, before the semester even started? How am I going to intentionally foster community with this group? And I always tell my students when I, start a semester with them, particularly undergraduate students, that I care about them and their well-being. And if there's something going on in their life, if they don't know who to talk to about it, come to me and I will tap them to the correct resource. And those things are, they seem small, but for a student, it could mean staying or leaving. And so I think those are some of the ways I work to build trust.
I would say for me, it'd probably be three things. I think one is transparency, and so kind of sharing my background. I think it's easy to look at the job title, the degrees, the awards, and think that probably I've got it all easily, and understanding that one of my salient identities is being first gen, and so I've had to figure out every step of the way of navigating higher education, from a student to a master's to a doc student to a professional. Like, this is all a first time for me. So I think one, entering the space in that way. I think two, being flexible. And so, of course you produce your syllabus and this is what we're gonna do for the semester. But I think for me, it's understanding that life happens for the students, life happens for me. And so I think about halfway through the semester, we did like a readjustment to look at some of the, if we need to change some things. And one of the things the students, they wanted to push back a deadline for their final paper. And I'm like, okay. Like, ideally it was set so that I had enough time to grade everything, but I'm like, if we push it back, that means it all needs to be turned in on that date and cannot be late. And so we had an agreement and we were able to do that. And so I understood that, like, they didn't want to have to write their paper over the Thanksgiving holiday break. They wanted to be able to be with their families and be with their loved ones. And so I understood that as well. I think the last thing I would say is just understanding. I think depending on what topic you are teaching, as the professor or instructor, it's easy to come in there with this all knowing, all knowledge. And so understanding that they're entering different spaces. So one of the courses that I taught last semester was the history of higher education for our MHE students. And so one of the things that we talked about early on is the impacts of slavery on higher education and understanding that slavery was happening all throughout this country. And I remember a student commented that she didn't know and had not learned that slavery was actually happened up north. That's not what she was taught, and she was from that area. And so for me, I could have approached it one of two ways. I could have been like, oh, well, duh, like you didn't learn this in history class. But for me, it was like, at this point in life, understanding that that's her lived experience. And so we need to create an environment where I understand that we're all learning in this, but also her classmates. And so making sure that we're kind of a judgment-free zone and able to learn collectively instead of criticizing each other.
I think a couple of the same themes, but in maybe different ways. So I really try to be authentic. I think look at a student in our program, like people know I'm a mom, people know that's important to me, people know I'm a Tar Heel. That is a very salient part of my identity. So I try to be like who I am, right? And bring my personality, my sense of humor into the classroom just so that they can connect with me as a human. And I do the same for them. What's going on? What matters to you? What do you care about? I think transparency, but transparency for me, I think in a slightly different way. Being transparent about my experiences of being a higher education administrator or participating in shared governance. So I teach a class on governance in higher education administration, and we talk about like the limitations of shared governance and the reality of change, right? And one of my students said they appreciated, and maybe I got a little more transparent post tenure. They talked about the candidness with which I had post tenure, but I think even before that, I was just really transparent about what I was seeing and experiencing in ways that were appropriate, in ways that didn't cross the line. But I just was honest with them about, well, here's why the president might not be writing the statement that you want them to write, or here's what's going on with the board of trustees. So being transparent with them about my experiences and what they may be living, I think is an important part of giving. So giving trust, right? Like to earn trust, I have to give trust. So I'm not sort of a facade kind of toting the party line about shared governance, right? And then I think it was yesterday, one of the, I think it was the students, panelists who talked about listening better. And I think I've tried to learn how to listen better over the last couple of years in my one-on-ones, not just being about course content, but what's going on, right? How's your health? What are we talking about, right? So just I think listening better and eliciting stories has been helpful for me.
Thank you all. So now we're going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to come out and invite you to ask questions. So who would like to ask our panelists a question?
Hi, I'm Isabel from Auburn University in Alabama. I have kind of the opposite problem. I teach a one semester, once a year class, 30 students, chem majors, chemical engineering, and elective for STEM. So it's about 30 students. My usual job is librarian. I can recognize and learn the names of the male students. For some reason, there are fewer males coming into this class now. The females with darker hair and who are people of color, I know their names. But this semester I noticed I cannot identify the blondes. I can't tell the difference. They all look the same to me. What suggestions do you have for me?
Something I do in my class. So in the master's program, we teach smaller groups of students, but the undergraduate course is like 32 students. It's a lot of students. And I also easily remember the men because it's a sex and gender course, and usually it's all women in the class. So it's like, ooh, there's 3 guys in here. They're probably stressed out, So I usually remember the men pretty easily. Something I do is I have them create name placards, like with paper, and I give them out every single class until the end of the semester. I don't care. And sometimes they tease me for it. They're like, you know my name. I know, but it's not about, at that point, it's not about learning their name. It's about the interaction that we have where I can say, hi, Julia, like, how's it going? I think when you have a bigger class, those interpersonal interactions that are one-on-one become very difficult, especially because in my perspective or my experience, this generation of students, especially the bigger the class, the more they hide behind lots of different things. And so I think that doing name placards is seems pretty easy, but doing name placards and having that one-on-one interaction with them when they come in, I think can help with your name problem. Not having them come up and just pick up their own, but interacting with them one-on-one. And sometimes you might mess up their names too. I mean, I've done that before, and I'm like, ooh, I'm sorry, my bad. And you know, it's okay. But I think making the effort, then they're more empathetic to you if you make the intentional effort.
And sometimes you realize you've been collaborating with someone for 2 years, looking for Azul, and have been mispronouncing your last name the entire time. So also owning up to those things and learning the correct pronunciation once that's acknowledged is. Thank you for that response. Thank you for the question. Other questions? Azul, you're next.
So way zoomed out, big picture, but I'm really curious. I've been thinking a lot about mentoring, but thinking about institutional supports for mentoring. And so when you're thinking about transforming higher education, I think about how do we communicate with administration? How is the administrative structure interacting, and what recommendations do you have if the idea is we want to make strong arguments for why we should have these things that we know will transform students' lives and will transform educational institutions? So I feel like you are a panel of experts. So like, what recommendations do you have from like an administrative perspective?
I think part of it is like, how do we make decisions, right? How are we engaging in this process? If it's an us versus them, I think that's problematic, right? So there's some really great models recently about equity-oriented shared governance that talks about we've got to co-construct the problem. I'm looking at my design thinking colleague over here in designing for this. So it's a design problem, right? Is that we've constructed these models that separate us and them, and we have very formal protocols for how things advance. And part of that is naming what's problematic about some of our structures and systems and the way we make decisions, the way we allocate resources, who's at the table, who has voice, and then beginning to reimagine what those processes are. So widening the circle, bringing more people to the table, co-constructing the problem, being open to revisiting policies and practices, I think is for me about again, because I see the systems and structures lens in my work versus sort of the individual centered. So that's for me my initial is beginning to change how we engage in the process of decision making and collaboration.
I would say maybe kind of how you construct the argument. So for me, I'm always like starting with the research. And so this is what the research is saying about mentoring. This is how it impacts whatever group that you're looking to focus on. And then giving them qualitative and quantitative data. And so not only the number of students that are participating in the mentors, but also these are the testimonials. This is how being in this mentoring program has impacted my life in, X, Y, and Z way. And so I think the combination of those three, for me, I think it's pretty hard to deny. When I was at the University of Missouri, I used to run a Black Men Initiatives program. And when I stepped into the role over the Black Culture Center, it was reshaping that. And so that is kind of the model I use. And it was one of those that the institution couldn't argue with. Like, this is the literature. This is what the data is showing about Black men retention at our institution. And this is our kind of goal to fix that. And so I think actually including numbers, depending on the population you're working with, is also important too. But finding ways to collaborate. So if you're able to collaborate with faculty, with staff, with alumni, with peer mentoring, with students, I think is really helpful because the more kind of hands of people you have involved to help shape that experience, it's kind of hard for, I think, the institution and institutional leaders to say no.
It's a collaboratively designed initiative, right?
Hi, I'm Azul. I'm a rising senior here at Elon University. And I just had a couple of questions kind of following up with what I believe Vanessa was saying. As a student, sometimes it feels like we don't have a voice or like a power. So like how can we make it so that like for instance, you had mentioned things about like identity taxation and things in regards to like tokenizing specific identities. So as students, how can we, again, like address administration or like people with power to kind of make it more inclusive so that maybe identities aren't like getting overtaxed or like so that there's more representation or things like that, because just sometimes it feels like, although we kind of do it the right way, like nobody's really listening, and it it feels like burdening, because it's like, well, like being at Elon and being at a PWI, it's really hard to come across like Latinx like faculty, and I don't want to like overburden them with like, oh, like, hey, like I know that we share this, but like I don't want it to just be, oh, because we share this, like you'd be a good mentor. I want it to be a lot more than that.
As we said, about easy questions.
Thank you, Azul, for your question. There's a lot in your question. So I'm going to try to break it apart. I think the first thing is kind of along the lines of what Jonathan shared. I think, unfortunately, and having previously been a college campus administrator, I can attest to this. I don't think sometimes administration, in the ways they should, takes the students seriously. And I think that can be a result of students solely speaking from their experience and not from also a place that is evidence-based. Now, I personally think speaking from your experience is very powerful. It's one of the reasons I do qualitative work, but it's important to be able to situate that experience in something else, which is why you can collaborate with faculty on those endeavors or with staff who are already doing that work and thinking about how do I kind of give my frustration and my desires legs in a way that an administration will listen to. So I think that that's the first thing in terms of kind of like being taken seriously and having concerns addressed. I think the other piece around mentorship is when you're somebody who doesn't share an identity with, someone that you could foresee as a mentor, there is a level of distrust sometimes, not for everyone. For me personally, sometimes there is. And in some ways, I test the relationship. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm saying it's more a protective measure. But I think there needs to be a willingness to seek out mentors that also don't share your identities and recognize that one mentor cannot do everything for you. And so, I have a mentor who is white and who has been helpful in different ways, but that relationship is a little bit more transactional. She doesn't do what someone else can do for me in terms of like meeting certain needs or validating me or, those other areas. I don't think that any Latina faculty who you want to connect with is also going to have an issue with you connecting with them, but I understand your awareness around placing that burden, but I think that it's not your burden to carry. And so I just want you to like be aware of that. But I think you can certainly advocate in the ways that I mentioned earlier. I don't know if that answers all of your question. You're welcome. Or if you had another one. I know you said you had a couple of questions.
I'll let other people speak. I don't want to hold the mic,
The only thing I would add is like, as a student, understanding that change takes time. And so thinking about the life expectancy of the average undergraduate student is about 4 to 5 years. And so some of the things that you may be fighting or advocating for, you may not see the change happen in your time at the institution, but it could help the future generations. I think sometimes when like having come from an institution, Stephanie and I were both at the University of Missouri during the fall 2015 protests. And so seeing some of the demands that they had and the things that they wanted, we weren't going to increase, like, for instance, Black faculty to 10% in one semester. And that's a lot of systemic things of, like, the percentage of Black folks with PhDs and who want to come live in the middle of Missouri and all of these things. And so some of it was getting the students to understand that, like, yes, you have good intentions, but this is not realistic and happening between the fall of 2015 to spring 2016. And so helping them to kind of understand the realistic landscape of what we're operating in, but then also understand the institutional structure. And so they may think, the person who's the director of housing has, all the power about what's happening in all the residence halls, and understanding that they report, to somebody else who reports to somebody else. And so knowing exactly, if you are going to advocate and do some advocacy work, who exactly are you targeting and kind of going for? One of the things that I've always reflect on as we come up on 10 years since those protests is the students at that time were going for the system president. And so he was the president over 4 different campuses. He was rarely in Columbia, Missouri. And so I remember back then and just reflecting, I'm like, well, why are y'all going after him when the issues that y'all are having, the people who are the decision makers actually are on this campus? And so it was just an interesting kind of model to be in and live through, because that was my first time being and living through anything like that. But now 10 years later to kind of reflect on it and to see some of the changes that were made. But honestly, when I look back on that experience and with the current administration and all the politics around diversity, equity, inclusion, they actually have gone way back than what it was 10 years ago.
I'm going to yes and that too. And I mean, we all 3 of us lived in Missouri, first of all, so I think I should say we all 3 of us were willing to live in the middle of Missouri. But I'm going to, the yes and the transparency, right? And that's what I sort of talk about. Helping students or colleagues understand the mechanics of power and the structures of power. Because I don't know that students are the only ones who sometimes are uninformed about decision-making and structures.
You don't always know how it works either.
But also,
especially.
building up to this, also collective action. I think too, when I think about, the longevity of change, part of that is if it's just you or one student who's moving this forward, when they leave, the initiative can die. But if we're helping our students or our colleagues build collective movements, that's where we see the rise of unions and collective bargaining and these other collective forms of action, that there's power in that process. So I think I would yes and the transparency and process, but also helping cultivate collective movements.
Thank you. Is there another question in the room?
Because if not, Azul has one. So.
Hi there, thanks for a great session, and I'm going to ask you to help find this question, because I'm not quite sure how to frame it. One of the things we've talked about a lot over the last 2 days is mentoring and then also boundaries. And I'm really curious, thinking about intersectional identities and boundaries, and how, especially maybe with white colleagues who are like, I want to help my students, I want to support my students, but I have boundaries, and I need to have boundaries. And that feels like a yes and, like we probably should have boundaries, and also we might be using them as defense, etc. Discuss.
Find that question.
I think part of it was the purpose of the boundaries, right? I mean, some of that I think, again, when I think about naming, what was white ideology is where are these boundaries coming from? Where do we construct these boundaries? And so we've got to be able to have conversations about what's the purpose of the boundary? What's the purpose of the boundary? So really, right? So asking again and again and again to not take surface level assumptions. I think for me, that's the start for me, is to really interrogate the purpose and the why, and to be able to explore the implicit assumptions that are framing them, and to be able to sort of disrupt those.
I think about this a lot. I think first, being Latina who is a professor and being, junior faculty and being perceived as junior faculty. And I don't know how to answer it from that perspective or the way you're asking it. But what I will say is I do wonder sometimes or think about often the ways I interact with students and the ways they interact with me. And I recognize that part of my pedagogy is this critically engaged, and I have an ethic of care pedagogy and all these things. And I think sometimes that complicates boundaries in, for me, sometimes uncomfortable ways. I do wonder if sometimes the things students expect from me or the ways they engage with me are ways that they would engage with another colleague. In, I don't want to say inappropriate ways, but in ways that I'm doing a heavier lift. than others, because I'm just like, would you do this with someone else? Or like, would you try someone else like this? Like, I'm not sure. And I can't always figure out if it's my pedagogy or my identities. And I think the part of, not a problem, but part of the issue is that they're so interconnected. Like, my pedagogy is coming from a place informed by my identities and experiences and arriving in that way. So it's always kind of like, it's just like an additional mental and emotional labor that I contend with often, and something I don't know that I have found space to figure out for the colleagues in the room who maybe are contending with like similar challenges or frustrations.
Thank you. I've got one final question for the panel, and this one I do know is coming. So, in higher education leadership, Rozana and her co-authors note that, quote, equity-centered collective leadership perspectives can facilitate the dismantling of oppressive systems and structures. As we navigate the current moment in higher education, particularly the U.S. political context and its implications for higher education, what would your closing challenge to us, both as individuals and as potential collaborators in collective leadership, be as we continue moving towards anti-racism in higher education?
I got into this morning and I was like, I don't want to answer this question. I said this to Jesse. So, I mean, as I was preparing my thoughts about this one, it's shifting because the dangers of doing this work are shifting, right? I mean, 2 weeks ago, before I knew that we were, folks were secretly recording conversations with staff and then releasing them, and folks were losing their jobs by being authentic. So we talked about, yesterday about we want to be vulnerable, we want to be authentic, but right now, that authenticity can lead to you losing your job and your benefits and your security, right? Like it's becoming, I don't know if it's more dangerous, it's different in a way,
Risky.
I guess. Risky, right? And so I was thinking, how do I leave it, and how do I send a message of hope, but how do I exist in this world with a moment of hope? And so I landed on continuing to do work, right? Continuing to do the work in ways that I'm comfortable with, that are reflective, and that I went back to critical applied leadership and the notion of doing the work in micro patterns, right? So thinking about the ways that I approach my teaching, my advising, my mentoring, my research in ways that are authentic for me, that enact many of the values and principles that we talked about yesterday with shared equity and leadership, but in doing in ways that, that challenge me, but I'm also sort of realistically comfortable with. So I'm going to continue to teach my students this year about the neoliberal psychic prison and how it shapes shared governance, right? We're still going to talk about neoliberalism. And I'm going to talk about the challenges of shared governance. And I'm going to continue to think about, how do I help people do qualitative research in different ways and in different methodologies. I'm going to continue to do the work and move forward, recognizing it's risky. And I'm not going to expect, I think the other thing I talked with Jesse about this morning is challenging people to withhold judgment of others people's actions, right? There are lots of times, why didn't my president send that statement? Why didn't somebody, well, you know what, there are consequences. There are real material consequences right now. So I want to be transparent with students of, that president has a boss. It's a board of trustees that's populated by political actors, and that's limiting their speech, right? So I want to be transparent and maybe withhold judgment from others around the ways that I wish they would act, if that makes sense. And I'll say, because I'm sitting next to the president of ACPA, but I'm also thinking about the role of associations beyond institutions to engage in leadership. So I'm looking to ACPA, I'm looking to NASPA, I'm looking to the American Council on Education to do some of the advocacy and critical leadership work because they have different parameters and access to power levers than institutions do. That's where I landed.
So to piggyback off of where Rozana left off, I would say the same. approaching the work, continuing to approach the work with an open mind and understanding that people are entering it in different places in different ways. And so thinking about some of the decisions or things that we may want folks to do, we may not have the full story. And I think as I've moved in my career, I understand that I always may not have the full story. And I think I see it more sitting in a president role for an association of like, people may not agree with everything that ACPA is doing, but they don't have the full picture. And I have to be okay that I am the villain in somebody's story and somebody may be upset with me, but I know the full truth and I know that I'm doing the best that I can with the tools that I have. And so I have to be okay with that. I think as a leader, it's hard if you're trying to appease everybody because then you appease no one. I think also understanding that what we're in now isn't new, and so people are tired. Like people, like I know that diversity, equity, and inclusion became a thing in 2020. It wasn't a thing just then. People have been doing this work for decades, and so those of us, and I don't speak for myself, I'm exhausted. And so there's some things I don't have the fight left in me, and I need folks with dominant identities, with power, you step in and do it, because I'm tired of saying the same thing over and over at the same table. I think for me also in being able to continue doing this work, I've had to really focus on my sphere of influence and knowing that whatever institution I'm at, like I can't change all the things at Elon University. I couldn't change it at Wake Forest when I was there, Missouri, wherever. And so what can I do with the scope and the sphere of influence that I have to impact those students, faculty, staff that I'm working with, or to make it better for the next generation coming? And I think for me, that is honestly what keeps me going and allows me to sleep at night. Because I think as an early career professional, fresh out of grad school, you're happy to be in the field and you're like, I'm gonna do all the things. And I wanna do all the programs and I'm gonna help all the students. And like, eventually it comes with a cost. And like, the reality is we're all humans too. We all have our own personal lives and things going on. And like, if we are not healthy and whole to show up to work, then we can't do that for our students and the next generation.
I don't know how to put a bow on this. And also, like what I was going to say was sphere of influence. I think sphere of influence is really important, and how you show up with your students, I think matters a lot. And the reciprocity of what that looks like in being able to be authentic to who you are, despite how that's challenged. I think in a lot of ways, when you create relationships with students that are genuine and from a place and ethic of care, you'd be surprised at how much you can trust them, and vice versa, that they're not going to be like, I don't know, out here. But who knows these days? But anyway, I think that that's really important, is working within that sphere of influence to kind of create impact and change. And I also think that caring for ourselves, I think part of what oppression seeks to do is like tear your spirit down and dehumanize you and others. And when I say dehumanize, I consider that oppressor and oppressed. Like people who both have privilege are dehumanized, obviously in different ways, and people who have marginalized identities are dehumanized, but that's the goal, is that we're so dehumanized that we no longer interact and engage with each other. And I think there's an active, conscious engagement to humanize ourselves and others on a regular basis, and finding things and ways to be able to do that, whatever that looks like, whether it's engaging in more communal kinds of activities or spaces that can do that work for you, I think is really important. So it's a little bit abstract, but that would be my response, trying to humanize ourselves.
And I appreciate that is a theme across all of your responses to that question, of remembering that we all are humans first, and seeing each other that way, recognizing that we may not see the full picture, recognizing that we all are facing other challenges, but thinking about the sphere that we can operate in. And then also, I think, helping our students and colleagues understand that there may be activities that have began long before they're in that moment. And so that prior work is also potentially weighing on us in the moment, and how we choose to act or choose to pass on action in that moment. So thank you, all three, for a very productive So I'm going to finish up our conference today with just a couple announcements. But first of all, just a thank you to everyone who has been part of the conversations throughout the conference. I really appreciate from our keynote yesterday with our students engaging with their faculty and administrative partners on just helping us think through what are some of the key lessons for mentoring marginalized identities, historically marginalized identities, currently marginalized identities, etc. And really pushing the idea of we have to build trust, we have to see each other as humans, etc. I can't adequately summarize all of the things that had me just cheering for you all yesterday. But I will note that the keynotes will be available on our website later once we do a little bit of light editing to the front and end. So if you, like me, want to revisit any of these conversations, know that there will be opportunity to do that. But also the concurrent sessions throughout the conference, I really appreciate the ways that everyone has engaged and really thoughtful inquiry about engaged learning and how we're supporting our students in all of our various higher education contexts. I want to leave you with just a few ideas of how else you might engage with the center's work. The center has formally existed since 2012, but our signature program actually predates the center. We sponsor 3-year multi-institutional, multidisciplinary, and often international research seminars on engaged learning topics. You can see the list of our past and current topics behind me. There have been 12 so far. And you can see that starting in 2014, we started a new one each year. So we have 3 running every summer. But these are a way, if you see one of our future topics and you want to commit to collaborative multi-institutional research, they're really transformative and they've led to significant outcomes. Publications, presentations, you can find those on our website. But we also track other outcomes, so things like curricular revisions of participants' institutions, changes in the way that they approach their teaching, their mentoring, their work with students across campuses. So watch for calls for proposals for those. Now that you've attended one of our conferences, you're on our mailing list. You certainly can unsubscribe if you want to. But know that we send our call for applications for the research seminars to that list every fall. Here's a quick snapshot. I was trying to update it this morning, and Europe is getting a little bit crowded. And I'm not sure I even have everyone represented there that should be represented there, but these are some of the spaces that our research seminar participants have come from. You can see there's some gaps I'm working to fill, but a really nice mix of countries in addition to institutions. Within these contexts, we also, as I am alluding to, have a range of institution types from really research-intensive universities to community colleges and everything in between. And that helps us really learn what works across institutions and what might be unique to one setting. And both of those outcomes are really valuable parts of the research. We also, as part of the research seminars, end almost all of them with an Elon statement on the topic. And so later this summer, there will be an Elon statement on mentoring meaningful learning experiences. Our leadership team for the research seminar and participants will be working on that later this week. But here are some of the ones that are already published, and you can find them under the publications section of the center's website. These are intended to be almost like white papers. They're typically about 4 or 5 pages. They provide you a quick snapshot of current research and its implications for practices. We also have a whole series of resource pages that are a little bit more intensive. They synthesize current research on the topic. They offer some examples of programs that might have really interesting ways of enacting these practices. And then they also curate some of our blogs on the topic as well as annotate bibliographies on the topic. So this is an ever-growing list, and we are working on also revising them so that they are up to date. And Peter's working on a revision when he just laughed because now he's hiding. But we have more in progress. Several of these are developed by our CEL scholars, which is a 2-year faculty role at Elon, and so for faculty in the room from Elon, know that that is also an opportunity. There are some current Sell Scholars and past Sell Scholars in the room who have contributed or are contributing to these resources as well. Others have been developed by Masters of Higher Ed students in our MHE program. And there's a MHE student working on a new one on signature work, so that will be coming later this summer. We also have a parallel set of resources on studying engaged learning, and a couple of things that I want to highlight. I would say that What is SOTL is probably our most consistently accessed page on the site, and it includes a lot of videos from folks who have been thinking a lot about the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. But also SOTL inquiry methods, so some of our librarian colleagues here and elsewhere have collaborated on resources that help us think about how do we find the background research that we need, how do we find the conversations that are already happening that we want to enter into. And then we're working on a growing set of resources on SOTL and promotion and tenure. So how do you demonstrate the impact of your work when you are applying for promotion, when you're up for annual review, etc. In addition to the resources that are already there, we just had a blog series published that Ellen Klein from our library here. You know, there's always something. We just work with it. But she's got a blog series that we've just published that you can find on the website. And then we are going to be adding some additional resources there this year. And then, there we go. We have, I've lost count of how many videos, but we have lots and lots of videos on the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, on a lot of the research seminar topics that we've explored, professional concepts. Please feel free to check those out. You can find them on our website under the video section. We also have a YouTube channel. And the keynotes from this conference, as well as keynotes from our previous conferences, are available there as well. And then, about 3 years ago, we added some podcasts. Not Winston was here earlier. I don't see my phone with it. Oh, okay, yes. So he's the creator of Blind Teaching with a Twist, which it's on short hiatus this summer, but we'll be back in the fall. It often focuses on, well, it invites a panel, kind of like our keynote conversation just now, to think about a teaching and learning related topic and what some of the current research might tell us. And then also include some students in the conversation to make sure that we are testing our understanding with the people that it actually matters for. So, 60 Second SOTL offers brief, almost like audio annotations of recent Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And Making College Worth It is also conversations with researchers who have been working on engaged learning topics related to the things that we know are most likely to make college worth it for recent college graduates. So we connect some of the center's survey research with research like that you all have presented here. That is also in collaboration with the students, so we make sure that the student voice is centered in our conversations about engaged learning practices. And then last but not least, we have 2 book series, and you likely have seen some of the example books out on our book table. The top row is some of the books in our open access series. You can download these for free on our website. It's free to publish, free to read. Our center absorbs all the costs of production. We are working on resecuring a print partnership with Parlor Press. So later this summer, those will also be available in print form. But the primary readership is through the open access PDFs that you can download from the website. The bottom row is our series with Rutledge. It was initially with Stylus, but now Rutledge bought Stylus. In that series, you can access those, purchase those through Rutledge. They have international distribution and they're available on Amazon, etc. So please check out both of those series. You also on our website can find information about proposing to either series. So if you have an idea for a book project, please talk with Peter and I. We'd love to hear what you're thinking, and we're happy to visit with you about whether it might be a fit for these series or suggest other places you might think about as well. So last but not least, This is an annual event. One thing I want to highlight is the conference is always adjacent to the research seminar that it's in its final year. So the dates tend to shift a little bit in June and July as our future dates highlight. So next year, we will be here June 22nd and 23rd, and that will be featuring research from our research seminar on affirming and inclusive engaged learning for neurodivergent students. And we always welcome previous presenters to come back and share updates on their work. So you'll see that the call focuses on the theme, but then there are also opportunities to propose under other strands. And then in 2017 will be one of our July conferences as we're wrapping up research on learning on location, place-based pedagogies in higher education. So please add those to your calendar. Think about coming back to Elon for these and think about proposing your work for them as well. Again, if you are attending here, you're on our list. So watch for announcements there. If you really want to unsubscribe, please do. But we encourage you to just watch for opportunities from the center and let us know how we can continue to support you in doing just great work in engaged learning in higher education. Thank you for a fabulous conference. Box lunches are in the back. Hate to call it to a close, but we're going to say goodbye for now.